Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the Asia 21 Summit, the virtual edition. Again, I'm Tom Nagorski, Executive Vice President of the Asia Society. Wonderful to be with you all. As we said just a short while ago, more than 40 countries represented in the audience tonight, Morning in Asia, represented at this first ever virtual edition of the Summit of our Young Leaders Network. Great to have you with us. We turn now to another look at life after the pandemic, which is the summit's overarching theme. And this one has to do with the global economy and the environment. The issue at hand, finding the best road or pathway to a so-called green recovery. One silver lining, if you could call it that, of the economic trauma that we've seen this year in the wake of COVID-19 has been the steep drop in CO2 emissions in many parts of the world. But that's almost certainly a temporary thing. The economic rebound in China is already sending emission levels back up again. And so this huge question for life after the pandemic, can the rebound be more climate friendly? Can there be, in some parts of the world at least, a green recovery? We just heard a short while ago, Dr. Rajiv Shah, 2006 Asia 21 alumnus, talking about what his foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, is doing and thinking about in this area. But once again, we have great voices to bring to the conversation here at the Asia 21 Summit, both from within the Asia 21 family and the broader Asia Society family as well. Beginning with our special guest, the former Prime Minister of Australia, now President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, the Honorable Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd has been deeply involved in climate issues in his own country and in terms of global policy, having ratified the Kyoto Protocol in 2007 and then legislated in 2008 for a 20% mandatory renewable energy target for Australia. He was a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on global sustainability. And Kevin Rudd also knows a thing or two about economic recovery, having led Australia out of the 2008 global financial crisis with great success and co-founding the G20 to help chart a path out of that crisis. Kevin will deliver remarks and then be joined for a conversation moderated by Emily Chu, Asia 21 alumna, class of 2015. Emily is currently head of global sustainability for investment management at Morgan Stanley. She just took that job. Previously, she served as rotating chair of the steering committee of the Climate Action 100 Plus Investor Engagement Initiative and chair of the Asian Investor Group on climate change. So she has deep history in that area as well for a young person. Emily will moderate and bring in other Asia 21 members to the conversation. But right now, joining us from Brisbane in Australia, a warm welcome to the Asia 21 Summit to Kevin Rudd. Kevin?
Good. Thank you, Tom, and greetings to everybody across the world and to the wider Asia Society family. It's certainly good to be able to spend time with you today. For all of you who are members of the Asia 21 family, could I simply begin by offering you a word of encouragement? And that is the world needs to hear from you. The world needs your enthusiasm. The world needs your innovation. And the world needs your leadership. And so for each and every one of you, whatever field you're in, could I encourage you to step forward and play your part in dealing with the challenges which our vast continent of Asia now wrestles with, those of politics and security, those of sustainable economic development, and those of climate as well, which brings us to our subject today. As Tom mentioned in his introduction, I've spent more time dealing with climate change in my own country, Australia, and internationally, than on most other public policy challenges around the world today. And I find a decade or so since assuming prime ministerial office in this country, the climate change now intersects with geopolitics, geoeconomics at every level. And therefore, it commands our attention. In my 4 or 5 minutes in my opening remarks today, I want to emphasize three things. Just to remind people, A, that what we are doing here is based on the science, B, where global public policy now stands on climate action, and C, what we can and must do in order to bring about a green economic recovery in the COVID recession, which many of us now suffer from. Firstly, on the science. Despite President Trump's best efforts and despite Murdoch's Fox News best efforts, there is something called objective science. There are things called objective facts. And where those facts and that science have taken us to is that unless we radically change our course of action in bringing down greenhouse gas emissions, then on a business as usual basis, we would end up by century's end with average temperatures around the planet on average being between 4 and 6 degrees higher than they were at the beginning of the century. And you don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar to work out that is unsustainable in terms of global food supply, global water supply, its impact on fisheries, its impact on rising sea levels and extreme weather events. That's not a subjective view. That's the conclusion of the independent panel of climate change scientists who every 5 years have been examining the raw data on this going back many decades now. It's also the view of the established scientific establishment in each and every one of our countries represented at this summit. That's the science, whatever may be said about the science by others who are driven by other interests in order to debase the science. Second, where have we got to on policy on this? Well, the world came together through what's called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, known in the trade as the UNFCCC. And the UNFCCC, basically, in the years since the Rio Convention of 1992, the Rio Earth Summit, has been gathering on a regular basis in order to work out what needs to be done, in order to get governments around the world to act to bring their greenhouse gas emissions down to the level necessary to keep average temperature increases this century not at 4 to 6 degrees plus centigrade, but at 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, which, while still difficult, is nonetheless sustainable, just. And so where we got to with that process over many, many decades through the Kyoto process, through what is now called the Paris process, is a series of agreed commitments by nation states under the terms of the Paris Agreement of 2015. Each 5 years under that agreement, each nation state which has signed up to it must further update its nationally determined commitments. That is, on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions it needs to bring down in order to play its part globally to keep greenhouse gas concentration within the atmosphere at under 450 parts per million, which is the scientific standard necessary to keep temperature increases below 2 degrees centigrade. Where we're up to now, 5 years after Paris, is that literally on the 12th of December, there will be a virtual summit of governments to apprise the international community of their decisions to improve their respective levels of national ambition in order to adjust their nationally determined commitments. What does that all mean in practical terms? Well, it means, for example, that if we are to have any hope of meeting our target of keeping temperature increases between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, that we must collectively, as a planet, agree on what is called net carbon neutrality by mid-century. The good news is, literally in the last several months, is that momentum has been created. The Europeans have long agreed to this target by 2050. They've now been joined by the Japanese. They've been joined by the Republic of Korea. And with the election of the Biden administration in the United States, they'll be joined by America too. Even China has agreed to net carbon neutrality by 2060, but leaving open the possibility that it will bring those commitments closer to 2050 with the evolution of new renewable energy technologies. And on top of the above, we have also not just mid-century commitments, but what must be done between 2020 and 2025, and between 2025 and 2030 by each nation state in order to take the mathematics of mid-century carbon neutrality work in practice. That's the global policy framework we're all signed up to. The third thing I'd said I'd address is, so what does that mean in terms of a green economic recovery now from the COVID-induced recession of this horrendous year 2020? Well, the bottom line there is the report card isn't so flash. What we've seen with more than $300 billion worth of stimulus around the world is nonetheless a series of actions by governments which have seen 2/3 of stimulus investments go in the direction of the traditional carbon economy, and at best 1/3 of those commitments being directed towards, let's call it, the renewable energy future. That's not good enough if governments are going to meet their Paris commitments, and it's not good enough if governments are going to meet their collective commitments to keep temperature increases in that range of 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. So what can be done? Number one, governments need to be pressured domestically by public opinion and by leaders like you in order to own up to their international obligations. And they can do that either by ensuring that their policy decisions in the green economic recovery do not make things worse. They could also, on the front foot, cricketing term, decide to make things better. One of the practical ways in which they can make things better is by radical subsidy programs to install solar panels on people's roofs right around the world. By simple local solar power stations, an enormous difference can be made in terms of the demand on the electricity grid, which would otherwise need to be serviced, often by coal-fired power stations. And coal-fired power stations are the worst generator by far of global greenhouse gases. That's in terms of governments, but there are other players as well. Private financial institutions making a difference. Because if governments are going to invest in large-scale electricity projects around the world, financial institutions, by and large, have a role to play in which of these projects are going to be bankrolled or not. Yes, some of them will be funded by public capital, but an increasing number would need to be funded by private capital or a cocktail of public and private capital. So the world's leading banks have a responsibility to ensure that their investment dollars do not go to carbon-intensive electricity generation projects, but instead go to renewables. But there's a third source of action as well, and that is to shareholders and consumers to bring their own pressures to bear on the very same financial institutions and electricity companies that I referred to before. Or if you're simply a consumer, to vote with your feet against companies which choose to be carbon irresponsible. So there are a menu of options, one directed directly at governments, two financial institutions, those who provide the cash, and three, humble shareholders and consumers like the rest of us who get to make consumer choices or to vote at their annual shareholder meetings. I think I'll leave my comments there, a framework in terms of what we have in terms of the science, what we've agreed to in terms of the global public policy, and what needs to be done now in terms of ensuring a maximum green economic recovery given the current COVID-induced recession. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Kevin, for your very lucid remarks. And it's really an honor to be able to speak with you on this topic with someone who's got such rich experience domestically in Australia and then regionally in Asia and now internationally as well. And thank you for your points around the validity of science and the fact that what we're dealing with here is very much based in an objective truth. When I think about the next decade ahead, coming out of the COVID crisis, but with 2030 also being a very key milestone for humanity to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement or to get in line with those goals, I think of a rapidly closing window. And really the challenge that we're facing is one of a realization of the oneness of humanity and the inviolability of our planet. And do you think of COVID as like a dress rehearsal for the level of coordinated and unified action needed for us to address an existential threat like climate change?
Yeah, it is a dress rehearsal, Emily. And the thing about it is that we've had a couple of dress rehearsals so far. We actually developed some machinery a decade or so ago to deal with the global financial crisis. It's called the G20. Now we've got the COVID crisis, where regrettably the G20 hasn't functioned as effectively as it did a decade ago. Although with the election of the Biden administration, I remain more optimistic that it will. And that what we'll now see is Biden, hopefully backed by the Chinese, using the machinery of the G20 to drive real outcomes in terms of renewable energy globally and greenhouse gas reduction strategies agreed to under the Paris Treaty. If you look at Biden's political undertakings during the US presidential election campaign, they are positive. Biden and the rest of the Democrat administration and his new special climate envoy, former Secretary of State John Kerry, these are folks I know reasonably well. These are all passionate individuals who get it. We don't have an advocacy task with them to get them across the science or policy threshold. They're into praxis, which is what do we now do? So I think we're likely to see during the course of 2021 the G20 brought into complete harness. And I'm optimistic enough to believe that it will at least be the one domain where the Chinese and the Americans will see it in their mutual self-interest and in the planet's interests, not just to collaborate, but to drive consensus across the rest of the international community. So I don't belong to the legion of climate despair who believe that it's too late and the window is already closed. I'm not sure the window's open for a whole lot longer, but I do know that policy makers and leaders, both in Washington and Beijing, unlike a decade or so ago, now fully get it and are prepared to put their foot to the accelerator. And
I'm glad to hear that you're an optimist because you see all of the pieces from your seat at Asia Society. You're not concerned about some of the other tensions in the US-China relationship potentially derailing the critical climate partnership that we need, trade wars and territorial disputes, and et cetera. Is there potential for some of these other tensions between these two superpowers to spill over and inhibit climate action?
Well, what I normally do in my day job is that I'm president of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and we deal with the full spectrum of these policy challenges. I spend a lot of my day on the political and security relationship and foreign policy relationship between the US and China and with other countries within the wider region. Generally, the technical term in international relations theory is it's one giant bucket of poo. It's not going well. Then we have, let's call it the economic basket, this rolling trade war between the United States and China, while still out of the headlines. Nonetheless, tariffs remain in place. Foreign direct investment flows between the two countries are shrinking. Capital markets have been affected. Technology war is unfolding, and a rolling conflict over the question of talent and standards. Technical standards is just about to get into full swing. So I'm familiar with that as well because we work on that on a daily basis. And third countries, apart from China and the United States, are radically affected by this, not just the two principals, as we're all asked to end up taking binary positions around one or other of the protagonists or the antagonists. But the third basket we work on, the Asia Society, is climate and sustainability. And here it's quite interesting. We've been working with our Chinese friends and the governments of Northeast Asia and Korea and Japan on carbon pricing systems for the last 4 years. We've assisted our friends in Beijing develop their own domestic carbon markets. We've assisted all three governments at a technical level on establishing the linkages potentially between the three carbon markets of Northeast Asia. And if you combine those three economies, you're looking at about 30% of global emissions. It's not insignificant. And that, despite geopolitics, collaboratively has worked reasonably well over the last several years. The final thing by way of encouragement, I'd say, is this. in the complete meltdown of US-China relations during the course of 2020, we, the brave foot soldiers of the Asia Society, we have been hosting second track exercises between Chinese and American climate change policy leaders with a view to this possibility that if there was a change in administration in Washington and a climate-friendly administration was elected, that China and the US could hit the ground running. Now, we've done that for the last 12 months, and these are with the most senior people on both sides of this particular debate. So I'm quite confident that we are going to be able to produce real results in the climate field, because it's in each of those two great powers' national self-interest for that to be the case. And that we will be able to, as it were, husband it closely, notwithstanding the tensions in mainstream economy and mainstream politics and security.
It's quite a complex set of factors you're dealing with, but very encouraging indeed to hear that you've been able to play that role. Moving to other parts of Asia-Pac. So the OECD has observed that many governments have included several $1 billion of green recovery measures in their packages. But as you mentioned, this imbalance is very concerning. This imbalance between support for traditional industry and green industry doesn't seem to be struck right if we're going to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Do you think that there are any Asia-Pacific governments or packages that have a genuinely coherent approach to the post-COVID recovery in terms of climate and green economic transition?
Two or three, in my mind, are worth reflecting on. Our friends in Japan have worked out that they need to act because Japan's commitments under the Kyoto Protocol were relatively easily met, those under Paris less easily met. And our friends in Tokyo have begun to realize they now must step forward in terms of the next tranche of renewables. Similarly, within the ROK in South Korea, and in at a smaller scale in New Zealand under Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. I can't give you a specific list of individual policy measures or programs that they've adapted, but if there's a common thread across them all, it's about turbocharging renewables. And there is a raft of policies that can be embraced there. Often with renewables, if you're having large-scale solar farms, for example, you need to have adjustments to the electricity grid in order to plug in. That is, the problem is not the cost associated with building a solar farm, which can generate multiple megawatts of electricity. It's how you plug in to the pre-existing grid, which usually means you've got to extend the grid to where that locality is. This is precisely the time that we should be doing that stuff. And secondly, to making sure that our electricity grids are capable of having feedback tariffs so that people who got solar panels on their roofs, for example, can resupply surplus electricity back into the grid. That's useful too. And finally, the simple adjustment of building codes. Why, for example, in our country, Emily, Australia, we do not have a national building code which mandates that every new structure, residential or non-residential, must have solar panels on the roof, rather than thinking about a retrofit sometime later. These are the sorts of practical measures which can be done. And finally, if there's cash to be had, cash can be had in also the decommissioning of existing antiquated coal-fired stations. In other words, stimulus strategies can be used for that in a non-wasteful way as well, which helps the overall process of bringing GHGs down and bringing renewables up.
Mm-hmm. Is there on coal-fired power plants, is there a risk of, first of all, that we have very rapid rollout of coal-based power in China, potentially cancelling out their ability to meet these 2060 goals? Is that a real concern? And then is there the risk that we fly into the arms of LNG gas through this transition, this recovery period, also inhibiting our ability to reach that 2030, ultimately 2050 decarbonisation goal?
Yeah, we've been dealing with the Chinese very closely on the question of, let's call it the tick up in coal-fired power station construction within China, really starting from about 2018, 2019, certainly through this year, and we're likely to see it continue to 2021. But if you work closely with our Chinese friends, their attitude to this, because they're also driven by the science, is that they wish to have sufficient coal-fired capacity to act as a reserve capacity for the overall system, and that their strategic thrust remains a large-scale increase in renewables over time. So their projection with the current 5-year plan, 2020, 21, I should say, to 2025, as far as coal is concerned, will look a bit like this. And so the peaking period in the current cycle, in terms of the construction of coal-fired stations, is likely to be 19, 20, and 21. And then when we get to 22, sliding down to 2030. And they know that mathematically that is essential if they're to make any sense at all of Xi Jinping's mid-century carbon neutrality mission, which has now been entrenched into Chinese planning documents. And whatever we may criticize the Chinese system for, and I've got many criticisms, one thing about our Chinese friends is that once it's anchored into a national planning document, it's more likely than not to happen. May not necessarily happen, but it's much more likely than not to happen. Your final point about LNG and gas more generally is well taken. Historically, and by which I mean the last 20 years, gas has been seen as a bridging carbon, a less intense form of carbon than coal, than either coal or oil for that matter, because there are still oil-fired power stations around the place as well. As you know, the science around this is changing in terms of the carbon footprint being generated by gas. So my only answer to that is that the Chinese energy plan of 5 years ago was out of coal, transition through gas into renewables. I think our Chinese friends and other countries now understand the importance of achieving the transition from coal into renewables much more quickly and at scale. But the new problems associated with gas represent a new complexity at scale for all national energy planners at present. Not insuperable, it's capable of being dealt with. The final point I'd like to add is we've been very frank in our dialogue with the Chinese about the problem of the Belt and Road Initiative and the fact that China is exporting coal-fired power stations and, for example, in countries like Pakistan, which have been constructed at a considerable pace. Now, a huge debate in China now is over the carbon neutrality of the BRI. Mm-hmm. It's not public, it's internal. Yeah. And again, your friends at the Asia Society are doing their bit to, shall we say, assist the forces of righteousness in delivering a decent outcome on the future of the BRI as well. No point in China decommissioning coal-fired power stations at home and then pumping it out abroad. As I keep reminding people around the world, the planet doesn't lie. National governments might, but the planet doesn't.
And that's one atmosphere. Thank you so much, Kevin. So I'm now going to introduce the rest of our panelists, and we'll have a discussion for the next 20 minutes or so on insights into the green recovery post-COVID. So Dr. Rashneh Pardiwala is the founder and director of the Center for Environmental Research and Education, a Mumbai-based nonprofit organization that works to promote environmental sustainability through formal education, government initiatives, corporate partnerships, public awareness campaigns, and advocacy. Dr. Pardiwala is a pioneer in developing carbon management systems for the service sector companies of India, and in 2005, she was recognized with the Ashoka Fellowship. Arnel Casanova is a city builder and a country CEO for AECOM, the world's premier infrastructure firm. He was previously president and CEO of the Philippines Bases Conversion and Development Authority. Arnel is also the founder of the 9,500 hectare Clark Green City, the Philippines' first and biggest smart green metropolis, and also led the rise of Bonifacio Global City. For his public service work as a peace negotiator, Arnel was also awarded the Philippine Legion of Honor Medal and the Presidential Medal of Merit, two of the highest national honors bestowed by the President of the Philippines. And last but not least, Gita Syahrani. So Gita is Executive Director to the Secretariat of Sustainable District Association of Lingga Temu Kabu Paten Lestari, LTKL, which seeks to accelerate and better support sustainable Indonesia's vision and emission reduction targets. The organization represents more than 52,000 square kilometers of forests and 55,000 square kilometers of peat, with nearly 1 million farmers involved. Previously, Gita served as a senior program manager for the Indonesia Palm Oil Pledge, a leading member of the planning and funding deputy of the former National Red Plus agency, and the sustainable commodities and business manager at the WRI in Indonesia. So thank you so much for joining us all today, Rashneh, Arnel, and Gita. So first, we're going to kick off with a question for Rashneh, because you kindly offered to offer your thoughts in relation to this question, which is, at the level of principles, what are the kind of underlying values or set of values or the value system that you think should guide the formation of policy and business strategy in response to the COVID-19 recovery?
Thank you, Emily. I truly believe that business leaders and political leaders across the world need to understand, accept that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. And I think it is when this fundamental truth is acknowledged, will our recovery to the COVID-19 pandemic be quicker? I think it will also make communities more resilient to future pandemics that may be triggered because of climate change. And I truly believe that economies must become more sustainable. As Mr. Rudd mentioned, it's not only the fact of countries adopting good policy, it's also ensuring that we become more inclusive for communities and also the other species with whom we share this planet. So one of the values, I think, is empathy, inclusiveness, which will help us survive as a species on this planet. Thank you.
Empathy and inclusiveness. Arnel, do you have any response to that?
Yes, I think, and that's a very good point made by Rashneh. I think more than anything else, this pandemic and all the other crises, global crises that would come in the future, because for certainty they would, is really the interconnectedness and inclusivity that's really necessary. That's exactly the core function of my initiative to really move people to higher grounds, particularly here in the Philippines, where we are one of the most vulnerable countries when it comes to climate change. We have super typhoons becoming much more normal. Just last month, we had 4 super typhoons. And we really needed to bring people together in a much safer and much more sustainable way. And that would be, the higher impact of that would be in cities. If we can make our cities much more greener, and a more population, and the population having a better quality of life, and then moving them to higher grounds. Because whether we like it or not, climate change is already there, and sea levels are already rising. Hundreds of cities and towns would be inundated, and as they are currently. And as an urban planner and a city builder, I felt it imperative that we should really have a plan to make our cities much more greener and bring them to safer grounds. So that's the kind of, and inclusion is an important part of that, because in the past we have always thought of our own individual interest. it's about time now that we really think about the greater interest of humanity and of the community.
There's really no better test of that than responding to the COVID-19 crisis itself. Rashneh, back to you. When we think about this idea of inclusion, the climate crisis is already having a direct and negative impact on portions of India's most vulnerable populations, and I imagine that you work with some of these populations.
Yes.
And to what extent do you think that the negative impacts of climate change has or could translate into a political problem for the Indian government? And how can they incorporate inclusion into their response to the COVID-19 crisis?
So if you look at, Emily, the ongoing farmer crisis that India is facing today, it's essentially a lot to do with climate change. Because India is a monsoon-fed, rain-fed agrarian economy. And a majority of our farmers, especially the smaller land-holding farmers, are entirely dependent on the monsoon or irrigation system. And these are systems that have been created over centuries. Now, with the onset of climate change, with extreme weather conditions of drought, floods, with cyclones hitting our coastal cities and our states, with increased pest attacks, thanks to pollution, farmers are losing their crops. There is a lot of strife because of numerous environmental issues. So on one hand, the farmer is grappling with low productivity or complete loss. And on the other hand, the government is also grappling with trying to regulate the import and the exports of food commodities. They're trying to regulate markets and their prices. And you can see that this conflict of both parties has come out onto the streets of India. And negotiations are on, and there are multiple rounds of talks. But unfortunately, climate change is not at the very heart of these talks and negotiations. The farmer is so dependent on the environmental factors, which are now not at all dependable. So we really need to look at improving our water systems, our fresh water supply, be it the groundwater or the surface water. We need to start encouraging and subsidizing organic farming instead of industrialized chemical farming, which is causing severe damage to the land. These are very closely interconnected issues. And we can see this farmer crisis with the new farm laws is causing a lot of political turmoil. In fact, today the entire country is on lockdown and is on a strike known as Bharat Bandh because farmers are right out there protesting. If we start looking at a more holistic approach to development, where every development policy is truly looking at the impact it has on the environment. And as Kevin rightly pointed out, it's not only the impact in your own country, but surrounding countries. So fresh water is an area of great political turmoil, even between countries. The large dams that are being created across rivers flowing through different countries, India, Pakistan, India, China, it's going to be extremely difficult if we do not truly pursue sustainable development in the true sense and the spirit. And this is only one sector, the agricultural sector. We are seeing the same sort of societal and political turmoil in every other sector, be it the health sector, where there is no uniformity of delivery of services. You look at the industrial sector, where yes, on one hand, we are promoting renewable energy. On the other hand, coal mining is still very much on top of the country's recovery agenda. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, we truly need to understand and accept and acknowledge that this economy is a wholly owned subsidiary environment. And it's unless we imbibe that, we would find it very difficult to meet the sort of target that the world has to achieve.
Thank you, Rashneh. Certainly would resonate with business people, this concept of a wholly owned subsidiary, the environment being the economy being that for the environment. But Gita, I'd like to bring you in here because you also work closely with agrarian communities, particularly through your work with protecting Indonesian forests. Now, maintenance of the world's forest as a carbon sink is a condition of the science that underlies our assumptions around the Paris Agreement goals. And yet we continue to see the degradation of forests globally year on year on balance. So do you think that the post-COVID green recovery goals could have the potential to tip the business case in the favor of maintenance of global forests and the potential to tip make the distribution of wealth fairer for those agrarian communities that are at the kind of the line of whether those forests stand or are destroyed?
Thanks, Emily. So in terms of what have been said by the panel as well previously, looking at climate crisis and looking at the pandemic as a momentum for us to rethink how do we communicate the sense of urgency in terms of delivering messages to on the ground community at our district, for example. When we say climate crisis, this might not be the urgent, there's no urgent sense of actually trying to tackle this type of problem. But if we look at it from disaster prevention or increasing disaster resilience, then it suddenly becomes a topic that is very relevant. Now, the way that we're looking at forest protection needs to have that type of paradigm shift as well. It's no longer the case that this is an elitist topic that can only be discussed by the scientists, but how do we communicate the sense of urgency in terms of protecting forests on the ground from topics that are highly related to day-to-day activities of the people? Now, the government of Indonesia, under the Low Carbon Development National Plan, have actually integrated climate change and disaster resilience as one topic. Now, this is a good momentum for us to revisit that and looking at how forest protection in order to prevent forest fire, peat fire, flood, landslide, etc., becomes actually an opportunity to bring in incentives for green industry development. Now, from our perspective, we have launched this concept called sustainable economy at the district level through jurisdictional approach, and maybe touching a little bit on the value that you asked early on, the value that we try to bring into the table and now have been accommodated in the national planning is the value of collective impact. So understanding that any type of success when it comes to building better can only come when it's being set as a shared target and when it's also being achieved through shared contributions. Now, we can no longer, wait around until everybody is on the same table, but this is the time where conveners, such as Asia Society, needs to come together and actually bridge this gap between people from different perspectives, different way of working. Government should meet private sector should interact with civil society should interact directly with the farmers, and vice versa. So this type of collective impact, we believe, are the future for forest protection, in which at the end of the day, people would see forests not as something that is burdensome to protect, but it's actually something that provides opportunity, be it the ecological function, making sure that the land quality, the water quality, as Rashneh pointed out, and the air quality is sufficient for us to push any type of economic commodities in the future, but also looking at it from an opportunity to build sustainable product that is focusing on being environmentally friendly and also socially friendly to be the trend in the future. So I'm looking forward for the days where we should no longer have an option than sustainable product at our table, and to serve our head to toe sort of needs on daily activities, be it coffee, skincare, healthcare, whatever that is. It should be something that is provided by nature-based business and solutions.
I love your idea of collective kind of coordinated impact. And it sounds like, Kevin, some of the things you mentioned earlier around the role that Asia Society is playing to broker some of these discussions is underway. So I'd like to come back to you, Kevin, to see if there's anything you'd like to say to respond to what Gita put on the table, which is the role of organizations like Asia Society to broker some of these interests. And how do you think that you, as you are now stepping into the role of president of the Asia Society, how do you plan to advance that?
Well, the good thing about Gita's presentation just now is that, as I've been taking notes from it, is that it covers the spectrum of, let's call it, climate change action. A lot of the international debate focuses on what states do, what governments do. Some of the debate now focuses on what financial institutions do in the deployment of financial capital between climate-friendly and climate-hostile projects around concepts of environmentally sustainable development. And then we go down to shareholders. Then we go down to consumers. And this is where Gita's point is most apposite. I like to turn head to toe and everything we wear, jackets we wear, glasses we wear, shampoo that we use, the beard soap that I use to keep my beard healthy.
Very COVID land, isn't it?
Apparently so, yeah. And to have a consistent national, international system of consumer environmental coding on products, so that everybody knows that this has been properly produced and properly certified, and avoiding the let's call it the rip-off merchants around the world from falsely labeling material which is not. I know myself when I go to shop, which is not often, by the way, because I'm hopeless at that stuff. But for someone as dumb as me when it comes to reading labels on stuff, it's not easy. It should become dead easy. There should be a globally consistent consumer product code. So to go to your question about how do we advance that, yeah, that's something that we, through our sustainability pillar of the Policy Institute, can look at how we propagate around the world. I was also taken in the earlier presentation by the great work that Arnel is doing in cities. Cities become the locus, frankly, of the success or failure of climate action policies because they are such intense generators of greenhouse gases. So all power to your arm there, my friend. And Rashneh, your comment about the economy as a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment is a really elegant phrase. Those of us who are economic nerds would describe this as economists and business for far too long regarding the environment as an external variable as opposed to an internal variable which has to be factored into markets and given value. But I think you put it much more elegantly. It's a wholly owned subsidiary. The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. That at least would break the lost in translation factor for all the bizoids that we have to deal with as they wrestle with complex concepts of externality and internality. And if they have about them, how do I describe it? A greater concept of the environment as you have in India with Mother Ganges, this is actually the source of all life. Then suddenly it affects what the Chinese would describe as their siwei, or a way of thinking. And if you change a way of thinking, it tends to change a way of behavior. So I valued these contributions.
Thank you. And Arnel, we're going to have one question over to you before we go to our audience Q&A. So just on this theme of collaboration across stakeholder groups and how coordinated action can be obtained. Based on your experiences in green development and green cities, how can you speak to the role of large firms like yours in fostering green capacity in their SME supply chains? So, do you think that they have a responsibility to foster that capacity or to demand it from the SME sector, create the incentives for them to develop? And also, do you think that where these green industrial clusters have developed or emerged, that they may be in a better position post-COVID to bounce back?
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Emily, and thanks for the kind words also, Kevin. I think for big companies like us are like governments too. You'll see companies are really the market capitalization of some companies are even actually bigger than nations' GDPs. And therefore, the responsibility of being big comes with it also of making our own business models sustainable. The greater impact also would be created if we also empower all the shareholders and the stakeholders. So it's not only the shareholders' value that we should care about, but also the community where we do business. Because that's basically, the earth is our business. The earth is one big economy that we have to take care of. Without it, then our own business would collapse. And that's exactly what this pandemic is all about, right? When we lose sight of what's really important, then we eventually suffer the loss of value that this pandemic had as a consequence. So, and what's important, I guess, is really to care about people in the environment. Let's always put that front and center of what we do. Our life sources, the water, the air, that creates value for all of us. And as a company, we should be very, very mindful of that and really incorporate that in the kind of culture that we have as a company, and also even in our personal lifestyle. If we really care about the environment, then we should really actually adopt a lifestyle that's also drive consumer behavior to change towards the green economy.
Thank you, Arnel. So we're going to move to our first audience question here, and I'm going to direct this to Kevin in the first instance. So behind green recovery policies are the tensions between CO2 emission reduction and economic competitiveness and job creation. So the cost of technology transformation, energy cost increases, etc. How to reconcile both goals, carbon reduction and economic competitiveness, and enable developing countries in Asia to remain competitive and to finance change while sustainably developing their economies. Do you agree with the premise of the question, Kevin, that there is a tension?
Historically, there's been a tension, much less of a tension now. And the reason is that through advances in policy, changes in finance, and innovations in technology, the unit cost of renewable energy production has radically changed in the last decade. It's come down probably by a factor of 10. And as a consequence, we now have, in terms of units of energy cost, not just comparable, but better energy costs coming out of the renewable sector than traditional carbon. So the good news for our friends in emerging economies is that this god-awful choice, which was presented 10 and 20 years ago, that you could remain permanently clean and poor, as opposed to advanced, rich and dirty, is no longer the binary alternative. And secondly, if there is, however, a transition cost to be borne, which often comes down to the nature, as I said in my earlier remarks, of the electricity grid and its ability to readily take up renewable energy production, large and small, then that transitional cost should be borne by governments through investment in new transmission systems. And if governments can't afford that in emerging countries, that's precisely what the multilateral development banks are there to do. Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and dare I say it, even the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That's their mission. So I think there is a way through this. It's no longer an impossible dilemma.
Thank you for that. Would anyone else on the panel like to respond to that question?
Yeah, well, I think we have available financing for most of the green projects. We also have the Green Fund, which is based in Songdo City in Seoul, in fact. And we also see the trend of companies moving towards the green space and choosing projects that would really be that they consider as their corporate strategy. So there's more premium on green buildings, there are more premium on green infrastructure, and the financing, I think, that's available. There's so much financing available now that could be tapped by emerging countries and even small and medium industries.
So Emily, just quickly, one point on that. In terms of available funding and financing, completely agree with what Kevin and also Arnel have communicated. We think both sort of public financing as well as private financing are available. Now, the biggest mystery or the biggest thing to address going forward is actually how do we connect that existing financing opportunity with actual ready-to-go pipeline on the ground, especially when it comes to projects that are generated directly from the community and focusing on maybe value-added product coming from district level or city level. How do we then connect the dots? Do we need to bring in more attention coming to the startup community and social enterprises, for example? Do we need to bridge the gap between large corporation with those or government with those? I think going back to actually how do we connect these dots, because opportunities are out there, but somehow it is still unclear. How do we link performances on the ground, pipelines that are ready to go on the ground coming from the farmers, indigenous community to this type of financing? So maybe this is something that we can focus on in Asia Society as well to debunk this myth, so to speak.
Well, I just was going to put forward the Asia 21 network as a fantastic platform to connect capital with projects on the ground and across the region as well. It's been such a valuable network in so many regards, and that's one of the values that it promotes. So I'd like to wrap us up now, and we are short on time. So I'd like to invite each panelist to address one last question, which is that we have a range of leaders and emerging leaders across the region with us today across all sectors, public and private, nonprofits, education, the arts, defense. And what would you recommend as one practical action that many of these leaders could take to support and or benefit from green recovery efforts? So we'll start with Rashneh, and then I'll ask Arnel, and then Gita, and then Kevin to respond. Over to you, Rashneh. I think you're on mute, Rashneh.
You're muted, Rashneh.
I'm sorry. I think the one main action that needs to be taken by any individual in the role that they play, personally and professionally, is to start living our lives in sync with nature. I think when we talk to businesses, the triple bottom line is very loosely spoken about, but it's really the bottom line that finally counts. For the mid-level businesses, the larger companies and corporations are adopting the cradle-to-cradle entire life cycle analysis of their processes. It's the smaller companies, it's the smaller stakeholders who truly cannot live sustainably, cannot practice business sustainably unless governments start helping them, unless governments really realign the model of development, unless that major tectonic shift happens in every country. It's not only the Asian countries, it's the African countries, European countries. We really need to start redefining our models of education as well. Because unless the future generations start understanding that the environment is not one for extraction, but one where we need to start reviving it, rejuvenating it, the future generations also need to be equipped to live in a land with depleted resources. Thank you.
Arnel?
I have one specific ask for the global community, and particularly the United Nations. We have to, if we can only stop all the wars and channel all the costs of waging those wars to saving the planet, I think we have better chances. Because wars are also created by a scarcity of resources and competition. But there is enough resources for everyone in the world. If you can stop all the wars and then channel all these costs to saving the planet and providing for everyone, we will have a chance as a humanity.
Arnel, Gita?
So a three-layered answer to the call to action. More to the individual level as professional, what we can do together is actually try to identify how your job is actually part of this jobs for nature. Any type of professions can contribute back to nature, and by realizing that, you can then connect the dots with people around you. Second part is you personally as consumer should make better choices and should encourage market signal that sustainable product is the way to go, and there should be more of that. The third of all is actually as an investor, both you as an organization and you as individual choose to invest, choose to finance, choose to support projects that are going to make a difference in the future, both socially as well as environmentally, come as part of a climate crisis mitigation effort.
Gita, and finally, Kevin, you have the final word.
My message to all of you as Asia 21 young leaders is this. Don't be pessimistic, be rationally optimistic. I find with too many young people in my own country, the United States, and around the world, that there is too much dystopianism about climate. I can understand the basis for that dystopian view about 4 or 5 years ago, but two things have changed, and maybe three now. One is technology has brought the unit price of renewables right down. Mm-hmm. Two, the Chinese are getting with the project. Three, even the Americans, after the Trump craziness, have now got with the project. And so you line those things up, and I think we now have a rational basis for hope. And the micro point I'd make to everybody is go and stick a solar panel on your roof.
It's affordable now.
And change the planet.
It's been such a delight to speak with 4 leading lights in the fight against climate change. Thank you. Please join me in thanking the panelists for their time and their expertise. And I'll hand you back now to Tom Nagorski.
Thank you so much, Emily, and the leading lights. And here's to rational optimism on this and many of the other subjects we're taking off. We've gone a little bit over, but that was terrific. Next up, here at the Asia 21 virtual summit of our Young Leaders Network, a special conversation about leadership and culture in times of crisis with a great leader from the Asia Society family in Silicon Valley, and another from the Asia 21 family who devotes much of his life and career to mentoring and helping train young leaders in Asia. That's coming up in a moment. Thanks again to everyone on this panel and all who've been watching. Stay tuned.